Get started, I just want to give you opportunity, make sure the live transcript and recording's up. Thank you. Looks like we're rolling there. Welcome everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar and engaging in this topic with us today. As all of you are experiencing, along with our OPI staff on the call today, we're all going through unprecedented challenges right now due to the impacts of COVID. And as you also are likely to know, these challenges are likely to persist with us into the spring. And that's really the focus and the impetus behind putting together the strategic waiver process and what information we have to share with you today. Before I get too far, I want to commend all of you for your efforts on ensuring that learning continues throughout this period. And we also really appreciate your partnership and your participation in this process as we tackle these difficulties together. So for today's webinar, we look forward to sharing with you information you should see right now on your screen. Our slide, these materials were prepared on January 7th, so they're accurate as of that timestamp. We're going to share with you information on the current addendum process, as well as the Montana strategic waivers, and also look forward to eliciting your comments, your questions, and your ideas on these topics. So I'd like to start with mentioning that this meeting is recorded, as all of you guys indicated that with your yes submission, and we will be taking meeting minutes and notes for the public record. After this meeting, we will post the recording and all of the materials on the waiver website. So I'll transition here to the next slide. So with this information, this is our first Zoom meeting on both the addenda process and the Montana strategic waivers. We intend to provide you information on both, and because of the size of the audience, we really intend to use the technology and the tools available to us to facilitate this conversation. And so as we can't really pass the mic around to each of you in this way, it might get a little unwieldy. We're going to do our best to gather information from the chat as well as the Menti features, and then there will be specific intervals in each of the sections throughout the presentation today, like this slide shown with the red. This would be an indication that we're going to pause on the section before we proceed, which would be a great opportunity if you want to come off mute to either share information, have a comment, questions, ideas at that point in time. So we will be making the agenda available to you. We will be making the PowerPoint slides available to you, the meeting minutes and the recording. Again, all of these materials will be posted on that webinar or on that waiver the waiver website. Too many W's. As I mentioned, so our timestamp, these materials are accurate as of today. And this is stemming from the laws, regulation, and the OPI's policies for both testing, accountability, and reporting. The purpose of today's meeting is to share with you that information, elicit your comment and participation in this process. We're going to cover 7 topics with you. So we'll start with just introduction and logistics. We'll share with you key OPI activities, some of the immediate OPI actions that we're taking, and some key documents and resources. And then throughout the entire presentation or the time that we have with you today, we're going to have public participation through those Menti tools as well as the chat box here, and then end today's session with sharing with you some next steps and future meeting information. So I really just want to emphasize that public participation in this work matters, and your comments that you will be providing us today are going to be used by the OPI so that we can address the requirements of the applications and these real world concerns. So we're really dependent on this process and our partnership with you. So if you're not sharing any information, we just ask that you mute your mic when you're not sharing. Our facilitator, Marcy Fortner, will be kind of unexpectedly monitoring any muting as necessary throughout the session. You're welcome to share your video. Thank you for those of you who have done this. I see a lot of familiar names and faces, and it's great to connect with you in this virtual way. And if you could also please make sure that your name is clearly visible within the participant section of Zoom. So if you go over to the little box that says participants and you click on that information, and then you click on more next to your name. If you could just make sure that your first and your last name is included there, and also your affiliation. So if you're with OPI, it says OPI. If you are with a district, it says district. If you're not affiliated with anyone, you can also just put self or that information. The reason that's important is it's going to help us with our meeting minutes and the record here today. And so knowing who's in the audience is really important. You can also introduce yourself in the chat. And so an example here, as far as information, as you guys will have just seen, I renamed myself so that you know I'm with the OPI. In the chat, you can let us know who you are, let us know your affiliation, and also the reason that you're attending today's session. You can indicate reactions and that kind of thing as appropriate. You can also let us know in the participant panel if I need to slow down, if I need to go faster, if you have a question, that information or that tool or technology is available to you. Oops, sorry for skipping past that. So as I just went through those first two, as far as how you can let us know that you have a question, how we know who you are in the audience, how you can participate in this process. So there will be appropriate times where Mential, it'll help us facilitate and get your reactions to some of the information. The chat though, if you have questions, you have concerns, you have ideas, throughout today's time, please feel free to shoot those into the chat. If I don't get to it right away, or one of my partners from OPI on the call doesn't see it right away, we'll make sure to address that, and I'll get the heads up from my facilitator that I need to pause for any questions or clarification. And then again, as I mentioned, on those appropriate sections of the agenda, we ask that you hold questions till those red kind of indication of a new section, just so that we can kind of manage everybody with their comments, their ideas, or questions at that point. So as each one of the OPI team that is hosting today's meeting goes through the introductions of themselves, I'd like you to just continue to introduce yourself in the chat. So who you are, where you're from, why you're here today. And so for who we have on the call today to share information with you, as many of you may know, my name is Ashley McGrath. I am the State Assessment Director for the Montana Office of Public Instruction. I will be a presenter today, and I have been with the OPI since 2012 and in this position as the Assessment Director for a little over 2 years now. And so I'll turn it over, and each of us will just introduce ourselves. So I'll hand it over to you, Julie.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Ashley. My name is Julie Mergel, and I am the Senior Manager of the School Innovation and Improvement Department here at the OPI, and I oversee a lot of the ESSA accountability system.
Thank you, Julie. Anne.
Thanks, Ashley. I'm Ann Bauer. I'm the Data Operations Manager in Data Technology. We work on the accountability system in terms of collecting data, reporting in the federal space, and working on the accountability system. I think I said that twice. Really happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Chantel. You're muted.
I'm so sorry. My name is Chantel Niederstadt, and I am the NAEP State Coordinator. My official role today is note taker, and I've been with OPI for a little over 2 years. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but not least, Marcy.
Hi everyone, Marcy Fortner. I have been with OPI for about 4 years now. Today I am serving as the chat monitor, sharing links and information in the chat with you. Spoken with a lot of you folks on the phone. It's good to see you all here, and look forward to learning more about what's going on with these waivers. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. All right, so the first kind of information to share out with you that's really important to this process is to present our concerned stakeholders list. So this slide shows to you what we believe entails that the person's likely affected from these strategic waiver efforts. So this graphic is designed to show you how critical stakeholders are to the process, And we are conducting this meaningful consultation so that the information concerns from you will flow up to the department. So this is going to help defend our request and our application through both of these processes, but it's also going to help us accurately reflect the pressing needs that you have at this point in time or this point in the school year. So as I mentioned earlier, public participation is essential to this process and also the likelihood of our overall success with these applications. So if you notice any information or groups that have been excluded from this list, it would be really helpful for us to know who they are so that we can ensure that they have adequate notice of what is going on and have an opportunity to submit comment or concerns on these processes. Here's another slide, and this is really just intended to show you the steps. I'm sure many of you can't really see all of the details here because it's really tiny font, but that's not really the essence of this graphic. It's really just show you that there's a lot of steps involved in these processes. This one's specifically looking at the strategic waiver process, and also just hypothetical in nature on some of the key things that have to take place in order for us to be successful with submitting an application. So an important point is public comment period is 36 days. That means this started December 23rd and will close January 28th. The application itself for the testing, accountability, reporting, strategic waivers will be submitted on February 5th. And so this is really just to outline all the things that need to happen between now and February 5th. So as I share information with you, so we're going to use Menti as a tool for this process. And so what I would recommend is that you can use your phone or other device, such as a laptop, to participate in real time and to engage in the comment, feedback, and actual activity with us today. I have set the tool up so that it can be completed at your own pace. So what this means is if you want to go ahead faster than I'm moving, you can do that. If you want to go slower than I'm moving, you can do that. You also can come back to this or share the link with others so that they have an opportunity to respond to this. It will be live for 2 days. And let's go ahead and get started. So you're going to go to menti.com and you're going to input the code. Marcy's going to share the details with you in the chat here. The code is 79896223. There are no spaces in that. And for today's presentation, we have 64 slides to share with you, but 21 of these are our survey questions. So you have an opportunity to give us feedback and kind of facilitate, participate in this process. All right, so we're going to go through these 7 pieces. So we've gone through the call to order, shared with you what the Menti platform is, the agenda, the affected stakeholders, rules for participation, introductions, Zoom platform. Now what we'd like to know is to actually get some information on the stakeholders represented in today's session. So the first one we want to start off with is where are you joining us from? So the demographic information that you're going to supply in these surveys is really for statistical and reporting purposes. And so we're going to use this to ensure that we have essentially reached out to a broad cross-section of stakeholders and also report our consultation efforts to the Department of Education. So this is really just to see if we had widespread geographic representation at today's meeting and are inclusive of our entire state of Montana. As you guys know, there's a few miles between each of us. So you can start to see that we've got 16 counts here and people are rolling in. As I mentioned, that at your own pace, you can continue to move slower or faster than I'm going to move. So I'm going to go to the next question that we have. So this question is, if you're in a school system or you have a student who's within a school system, if you could let us know the size of that school system. And if that's not applicable, you can indicate other. All right, another hot topic here is asking folks on the call about how instruction is primarily being delivered to students in your school system. And really with the COVID pandemic, this is something that's really changing the way our understanding of statewide assessments is actually working boots on the ground. So if you can give a moment to respond to that. And the last question here is kind of what hat you wear. So many of you may be system test coordinators, you may be educators, you may be a parent or a taxpayer. If you could let us know what your role is, that would be great. All right. So I want to take a moment to pause here and give you guys an opportunity if there was anything that we covered in that first section. So that call to order, Zoom platform, introductions, agenda, stakeholders, rules, process, Menti, to give you an opportunity to share your comment or concern. All right, I'm not hearing any or seeing any in the chat, so I think it's safe to move on. So I'm going to transition over and hand you the mic, Anne, although we're not in the same room, so that you can share this next section on key OPI activities.
Thank you, Ashley. Okay, so we really are making a lot of, hang on a second. We're really trying a lot of different avenues to collect public comment. And this is one, and one of our more important. I'm really happy to see so many participants here today, and really excited about getting some good, robust discussion about what? Well, we have three things going on. We have an addendum process, we have a waiver process, we have an amendment. We don't actually have an amendment process in process right now, but we will reserve that right, and potentially some of the discussions today might lead to explorations of that. So what's happening right now? We have the ESSA addendum process. So we had some waivers back in 1920. I'm going to show you a high-level graphic here in a minute. We had some waivers in 1920 for the assessment, for the accountability, for the report card, and for some financial flexibilities. And we put out that in a similar process as what we're completing today, and over the next 36 days. And what was not addressed in that was that the absence of having assessments in 1920 drove us to the conclusion that it's really not going to be possible to administer the accountability system for the 1920 data. I mean, and there are other considerations besides assessment, but that was a primary one around the growth data especially. So what we're doing with that is we're calling that an addendum because we are adding on to that 1920 waiver that's already been granted. So we're asking them again, we're saying, hey, we're looking backwards, we're looking for completion of that essentially. And at the same time, COVID is continuing. So we are looking at another waiver. We're calling this a strategic waiver. This again is going to be for testing. This time it's for the year we're currently in. It's for 2021. It's a waiver of assessment, accountability, and certain of the report cards. We have a little bit more flexibility than we had last time. The 1920 waivers were granted almost on a template basis. The USCD was very quick to be responsive and grant us those waivers. They were also fairly already defined. And so we have some time and space this time to look at maybe we want to do things a little bit differently. So the last piece that is a potential is that amendment process. We have our ESSA plan. Neither the addendum nor the waiver produce permanent changes, but an amendment process could. And as we look at the effects of COVID and we look at our experience with the accountability system thus far, it may come to pass that we decide that amendments to the ESSA plan might be necessary. And that is, again, like the slide says, to be determined. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I got into those definitions a little bit, but I'll kind of walk through it again. The addendum process, if allowed, are those temporary changes, and they're looking backwards again to those 1920 waivers that already occurred. The waiver process, we want to provide states with relief from those statutory requirements around, again, assessment and accountability and report card. Amendment changes would be permanent, and they would be addressing changes for this year and potentially beyond. So just kind of leaving a pin in that whole amendment process. And just here's a visual. So we had the 1920 assessment accountability and report card waivers granted in March of 2020. And those led to, as I mentioned, those led to needing the additional waivers around, additional, I have trouble with this language a little bit. So I'm really trying to be careful to say the right things. And this is also why I'm engaging in some, what I hope is creative repetition of the terms. So right now we are seeking an addendum and a waiver to add to those March waivers. There is a little bit of a bureaucratic nuance related to that language. I'm going to leave it alone and just call it an addendum, okay? Because we're just really adding to. And at the same time, we are seeking those new strategic waivers for the year that we're currently in. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's get into some nitty-gritty details about what the addendum does. Through that, we want to address some of those effects as we were talking about that backwards look at the effects of the 1920 waivers. What we are proposing is that we're going to shift those timelines forward by 1 year for identifying and we've used some abbreviations here, some acronyms. Let me tell you what those mean. For identifying CSI, that is the comprehensive schools that are identified based on the performance of all students in the school. Then the other acronym is the ATSI, that's additional targeted schools that are identified based on a subgroup of students. So we're shifting forward those identification timelines by 1 year. Why? Because, as we mentioned, without the assessment scores, it is really impossible to calculate growth. And the way that Montana currently calculates growth is with adjacent test scores. So we calculate the growth of little Bobby's 3rd grade proficiency levels with little Bobby's proficiency levels in 4th grade. And we say, after we've calculated that Z-score, has little Bobby grown? So if there's a positive movement there in Bobby's proficiency, we count that as a student who has grown. Obviously, if we don't have Bobby's test scores for this year, we can't tell you if Bobby had any growth. So there's that growth indicator. And then we also have what's called the student quality or student success. You might also have heard this referred to as the 5th indicator. The first 4 indicators in the ESSA accountability system are required by the federal government. That SQSS or 5th indicator is one in which Montana gets to define it. And just very, very briefly, Montana added in a component in that SQSS or 5th indicator related to attendance. And as we know, on or around March 15th of 2020, many of the schools immediately and suddenly went remote. And so how do you compare attendance for this year? So that's another reason for seeking to not run the accountability on those 1920 data. So that's shifting forward those timelines. And we also, if we do that, we're going to need to shift exit criteria because we have schools that already are identified as comprehensive and as additional targeted. And how do we exit them if we don't have those data? And so we want to shift that exit criteria forward. We also accordingly want to shift forward timelines for measuring long-term goals and measures of interim progress. And finally, this is the nuance that I kind of glossed over earlier. We want to waive that annual requirement to identify targeted schools in 2021 for consistently underperforming. And rather than give you a lengthy and bureaucratic explanation of that targeted, let me just tell you that what all I just said, this whole word cloud that I just gave you, is all about not identifying schools for the ESSA accountability system based on the 1920 data. And if anybody has specific questions related to that, I'd be happy to answer them. But for now, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so in a nutshell, here's what the waivers do: cancel the requirements to administer statewide assessments this coming spring, suspend the accountability system for those data, and remove certain elements from that 2021 ESSA report card. And as I mentioned, this is an opportunity for us to be a little bit more flexible than we were last year related to those report card elements. So I'll just put that out there. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so amendments. I had mentioned that there is a possibility that the ESSA plan may need, or we may want to put in an amendment. So we don't have any under development right now, but if any amendments were proposed and agreed to, we would need to submit those to USCD by February 1 of the school year prior to the implementation. And again, those are designed for permanent changes to the ESSA plan. Nothing that we're talking about with these waivers or the addendum is a permanent change. It's just a one-year deal. Okay, that's all that I have. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anne. Greatly appreciated. So I want to pause there to see if there are any questions for Anne before we transition to the next section. All right, I'm not hearing any or seeing any in the chat. So this section is going to be a tour of our immediate actions that we have underway that are providing schools with relief. So the first thing we wanted to share is the comprehensive and targeted schools will continue to receive supports and interventions consistent with the school support and improvement plan through the 21-22 school year. Also happening right now, for those of you who've already seen this graphic or explanation, I apologize, but I do want to make sure the audience understands some of the nuance that is happening on the immediate actions that we're taking. So you can count on the two columns that have this check mark in place. So that would be that blue current column and that gold in progress column. And so looking at the current one, we want to be really clear that the participation requirement to administer the annual state assessment is required under federal and state law. Access for ELS testing is underway and must be completed by February 26th. It is not included in the strategic waiver process. The next piece is we want you to plan on delivering tests this winter and spring, because as we know, there's a lot of pre-work training and effort involved on the front portion of the testing cycle. And in the event we're not successful with this waiver pursuit, we want you to be prepared to administer these assessments. Where possible, the test windows will be extended, but some of these are outside of our control. But where we are able to extend windows, we will make sure that is taken care of. And an update, this is new information. The U.S. Department of Education reached out to confirm that we are approved for our field test waiver for science. So what does this mean? This means that the waiver that we had in place last year for the field test has been extended to this year since we didn't get that opportunity to deliver the science assessments. And what it essentially does is removes the accountability and reporting requirements. However, participation is still a key aspect of the approval status for that waiver. So looking at the in progress section here, here's some other activities that we have underway and that you can count on happening before the assessments go live in March. So the shortened Smarter Balanced test that will be in place. So you can expect to see a Smarter Balanced test that's between 3 and 4 hours compared to what was formerly 6 to 8 hours for students. There will be no remote proctoring. Another way to describe this is at-home testing for state assessments for serving remote learners. There will also be a 1-year medical exemption option for COVID reasons. And I'll explain a little bit more about this on the next slide. And the things that we don't have any guarantees in place. Again, this is dependent on the department's determination of our application. So this falls under ESSA section 8401 process, the waiver section. And what we're looking at are the statutory requirements for testing, accountability, and reporting requirements. So when you're in process, that means states and districts cannot act on these waivers. And under the statute, the department has up to 120 days to make that determination. So we just wanted to be really clear so you guys have those expectations in place as we move through this school year. So the Access for Else testing progress, as I mentioned to you, this is not included in the strategic waiver effort, but one thing you can count on is that medical exception for COVID reasons. This will be permitted. Our office is working on releasing guidance for this towards the end of January, and then the MONTCAS application for system test coordinators or principals who report instances of non-participation would be able to report those instances at that time. We're hopeful that that will be in place in February. And so what we want to talk about is kind of the details for a medical exception for COVID reasons. So this decision would be determined by the district and the family. I want to emphasize that it's never allowable to exclude a student based on expected performance, difficulty giving the test, so for instance, remote setting, student disability, or English learner status. So it is our responsibility as the Office of Public Instruction, as well as school districts' responsibility to uphold these civil rights and protections for all students. So I just want to be really clear that we're not discriminating against any student for any particular reason that they have in place based on their instructional setting. The child must be provided the opportunity for whatever reason they are unable to participate in the test. So either due to a personal COVID reason or family. So some examples that we've been hearing about from districts is the child is medically fragile, vulnerable, unable to test on campus. It is not safe for the remote learner to participate as it creates an unsafe environment for staff and student. Some of those are examples of what would be qualifying medical reasons. And then I think it's also really important to just share that health and safety of staff and students is our primary concern, and that you should expect to follow state, federal, and local public health guidelines to protect everyone. So before transitioning over to the theory of action behind the Smarter Balance assessment and our shortened blueprint, I just wanted to reemphasize again, it's the OPI's and district's responsibility to provide equal, fair access for all students to these educational services and opportunities. So this applies to all students we serve. So balance assessment system. So the reason the OPI can justify the blueprint changes for Smarter Balance assessment this school year is kind of multifaceted. So we have heard a lot of districts are prioritizing instructional content, given the nature of kind of disrupted instructional schedules. Instruction itself has looked differently across the state. Resources have looked differently and capacity has looked differently across the state. And so as a result of the pandemic and the need to focus on the basic educational services for our students, we are able to justify reducing the testing time so we can help preserve that instructional time for students and staff. And so I also want to point out though, so why did I put this graphic together for you? If it's a COVID reason, why do we have this here? It's not just a COVID response to demands that are in place because of the pandemic or school schedule. This also fits our OPI theory of action for a balanced assessment system. So a shortened summative test can lead to a multi-measure approach. if we're appropriately weighting and distributing some of those instructional tools that we have at our avail so that we get the appropriate grain size and frequency that we can make meaningful adjustments to support student learning. So that means having multiple tools as indicated with the slide. So a state summative, interim assessments, formative resources, and these are all available and aligned to the Montana content standards with the Smarter Balance suite of services that we have. So a balanced assessment system, it can be thought of as a continuum of strategies. So that's ranging from things like your formative assessment or those classroom resources to periodic checkpoints that you have in place, like those interim or benchmark assessments, to the final annual state summative assessment that's characterized that we have in place with the Smarter Balance. So we're able to support this because, again, these are available free to all teachers and districts within the state of Montana. They're readily available now. These have been turned on since early this fall. Another key piece is they promote equity and accessibility. That these tools were created with that in mind. So if you are facing a remote learning situation, another nice thing about this is we've made the interims available to be delivered in a remote setting as well. So it helps you essentially make sure these students have the necessary supports in place so that they can meaningfully engage in the content. So looking at that balanced picture of student learning and these many different points, really this is de-emphasizing then that summative footprint that we have in place. And so, you know, just going back to my classroom experience when I was a high school biology teacher, I wouldn't essentially take Johnny's one example, that one end of chapter quiz that he had, and characterize that as everything Johnny knew about biology. And the same should be said then with our Smarter Balance or our state summative assessments. Really, this is one data point, and it is very meaningful and valuable under the right conditions, except in looking at what we know about a student's learner or that picture of learning across the school year. We don't want to use it to make those high stakes decisions and adjustments. So this supports ultimately going back to that theory of action that we have in place. So as far as shortening the Smarter Balance blueprint, essentially we're de-emphasizing that state summative for this school year. So here's a glimpse, just a state report to share with you guys on some of the interim completions that we have so far this school year, and some of the information we have about new educators accessing the tools for teachers, or that formative repository that's in place with the Smarter Balance assessment. And so looking at these results, you guys can see that there's a lot of merit that schools are seeing and using these tools to complete them, even though this year has been very trying for all of us. And this is kind of a key thing that's happening, is making sure that all students are receiving high quality access to instruction this year. How do you know? How do you have evidence to say what they essentially are know and are able to do? So with that, that kind of highlights for you guys on the immediate actions the OPI is taking on all of those topics, which there are many of those subtopics. So I'll give you a chance here if there are any questions on the immediate actions and before we transition to the next slide. So this would be a pause in our section as well if you want to come off mute or put something in the chat or respond here in the Menti survey. All right, not seeing any chat, seeing some come through with the Menti survey, not hearing any. We'll go to the next section of our agenda here. So this section in the bottom corner there are a few corrections to this, just so you know. It should say slide 30, so you kind of know where we're at in today's program. This slide indicates some of the key documents and resources that we have in place for the addendum process. So when these slides are made available, each of these has a direct link to the resource that you can access at a later point. And to learn more about the key documents and resources for the strategic waiver process, the same thing is true for this slide. So these resources help describe some of the complexities of this topic, the rationale behind the effort, so that would be included in that cover letter, and the immediate actions the OPI has taken. So just that tour I already gave you on the things we have in place or in progress, and the flexibilities that we are pursuing within our office. So these are interaction slides, and what they're intended to do is essentially let you tell us how useful these resources are to informing you, the public, about what is going on with the addendum process and the strategic waiver process. So you could indicate with a heart, for instance, that you love the resources, you found them very useful. You could send in a question, meaning you have questions about the resources, they're unclear, or you didn't even know they existed. And the other tools there, you like them, you found them useful, or you don't find them useful and you don't like them.
Ashley, while you're paused for those reactions, we do have a question in the chat. Kim was asked, she said her school is a BIE school and she's wondering if they will have the same criteria.
Thank you for sharing that question, Kim. I'm a little unclear what the criteria would be. Would you mind coming off mute and explaining that or clarifying in the chat? And I can also stay on the call after we're all done with the presentation. If you have any one-on-one questions that you don't feel comfortable asking in the full group, I'm happy to stay on later to ask at that time. All right, I'm going to transition to the reactions for the strategic waiver purpose, that cover letter, why we're doing this. The same kind of information. We want to make sure these are useful, that they've clearly articulated the why. The next artifact that we have is that addendum timeline. For the timeline with the addendum process, is this resource clear, useful? I'll transition to the next one. Our strategic waiver timeline, a different timeline here. Is this clear? Is it useful? And now we have some frequently asked questions that have been prepared for each of these processes. So is the addendum FAQ clear and useful? Is the waiver FAQs for testing, accountability, and reporting clear and useful?
Ashley, we have another question in the chat. What documentation is needed from districts when using COVID as a medical exemption?
Thank you, Marcy. I'll respond to that on our question slide. If I can just pause for a second. And there are two more here on the key documents and resources. So the addendum site, the website, is the site clear and useful to you? And last but not least, the strategic waiver website. Is this resource clear and useful to you? So for the question on any future OPI actions or key documents and resources for addendum process and strategic waiver process, thank you for letting me pause to address the question that Arena submitted here in the chat. So what documentation is needed from districts when using COVID as a medical exception? So the documentation, the policies, procedures, that guidance will be released later this month on essentially examples of and non-examples of qualifying medical reasons as well as COVID reasons. And so we'll make that available. As far as specific documentation, if you're talking about like a health record, for instance. So one of the things that, as far as reported to the OPI will not ask districts to report essentially medical record information to us. That might be something that you need within your district to essentially understand what's happening there, but that's really a local control and district decision. So going back to that information on who is making a determination about a medical exemption for COVID reasons, this is really a district and family decision. So if you have the justification and evidence within your school system to make that, that is what we need. So you will report either a medical reason or a COVID reason, and you will explain the reason within there, within the MONTCAS application, as long as we are certain that the students have been afforded the opportunity to participate in the assessments and it falls within those examples of and non-examples of, those would be qualifying essentially medical reasons that we would essentially grant through that process. Does that clarify everybody's questions with that process? So I guess in a nutshell, more information is coming. All right, I'm not seeing any questions on this one, so I'm going to transition to the next section here. And so just a correction on this slide. Again, my apologies for the inaccurate display of which section it is. So we're on the public comment tools section here. So there's a lot of questions within this section that we're hoping you can help us with, essentially get the information from you guys to help support our application process. So looking at tools, we released on December 14th, the addendum process survey at January 6th. So that's timestamp. We had 4 responses to that public survey. And the information here again will be really useful to us to help us submit that application. I transition to the next one. We also have a public comment survey for the strategic waiver process. As of yesterday's time, there were 27 responses within there. This, although there looks like there are a lot of question in here, the first part, just as we kind of went through as far as getting demographic details, are the only ones that are required. The rest are optional, so you could kind of go through there and provide your response. Again, the information that we collect from you through these tools is going to be really imperative to our ultimate success of our application process. So the first set, each kind of section, there are 3 with this. So whether you support it or not, benefit you find from it, and then also your concerns with it. There's one for addendum, there's one for testing, accountability, and reporting. So we'll start here with that addendum process and whether or not you support that effort. And I'll transition to the next slide. Again, you can complete this at your pace. So this one is, if you answered yes, what is the benefit to the addendum process? Again, your response here is going to be really important to our overall effort. So we greatly appreciate your contribution. Our next is any concerns that you might have with that addendum process. And anything you have to share is valuable. So as an example, it's hard to understand. What we can do with that response is essentially make sure we clarify information in our next webinar or within the public information that we've already released so that it's really clear to all stakeholders about what we're doing, why we're doing it. So transitioning to the next one, do you support the strategic waiver for state testing? And if so, the next question is, what is the benefit? And then similar to the last set, what are your concerns with the testing? And our new set, the new set of 3 is going to be for accountability. So do you support the accountability request for the strategic waivers? And if you answered yes on that, what is the benefit? And with this accountability, do you have any concerns? And our final set of 3 for reporting, do you support the strategic waiver for reporting? And if you answered yes, what is the benefit? And do you have any concerns with the reporting? All right, so the last question before we have open for public comment for any topics not published on the agenda is regarding funding. So do you have any concerns about funding or programs that rely on these data? So there may be grants or things that are not included within the statutory requirements under ESSA, or that has not come to our attention, that may rely on statewide assessments that are not covered in our application process. If that's the case, for any of those programs, do they rely on these data? Could they be waived or explained away? If there is a funding concern, your information or response on this question would be very valuable to our application process. All right, so as you guys can see from today's session, we've put a lot of effort and work into the public participation and comment process. And we want to make sure that all stakeholders essentially have sufficient time and notice of these activities. So I'm going to pause here to see if there are any public comment on any items that were not cited in the agenda that we essentially need to address for future meetings or within our process. All right, not hearing any or seeing any in the chat. Again, a correction to this slide. It should say next steps in future meetings. So we are now on slide 59. This is a summary of the upcoming webinars that we have this month and activities. So if you want to participate with us again or any of these public events, you're welcome to do so. They are open. And we will make these slides available. So if you just want a quick link into essentially registering for each of these events, you can do it that way. You could also look at that strategic waiver timeline that I've put at the top to get access to these events to participate. So with that said, one of the things that we will be doing at the end of this month, so January 28th through the 29th, is we will be having our ASSIST conference. And so we're really going to share with you guys what our working plans are for the spring of 2021 with our content area assessments and what resources, tools, technology, those kind of things are available to you. We're really excited for this year's conference. It's going to be the first time we're doing it virtually, but we think we've got a great team in place to deliver you some really high quality professional learning to serve your needs at this point in the school year. We'll also share with you where we're at with the waivers and our policy. We're going to share with you some of the kind of instructional tools that you might find useful, like the formative and interim resources I mentioned earlier in today's presentation. We're going to share with you equity and access content. We're also going to share with you kind of opportunities to learn and look at student achievement in different ways. And last but not least, data use and reporting. So there are 2 remaining slides as far as your survey, whether or not your needs were met from participating in today's webinar. And the last one, anything you have concerns out that you would like us to know about, so we can make sure we get you the information that's most beneficial and helpful to you. All right, so I will stay on and be the last one in the room till everybody leaves. Thanks again for joining us today and participating in this process. And I really truly see us as critical partners through this all. So thank you for all you do. Take care. Bye-bye.
Ashley, before I jumped off, I was just going to say hi.
Hi, Christy. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Very good. It's a long time no see, but it's so good to hear your voice and see
I
you
know.
in this
I
way.
know. It's good to see everybody. Hi, everyone. Hey, Chris. I was trying to wait till I saw people sort of departing before I said hi, but I just wanted to say hi to everyone and great job. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much.
Hey, Christy, how's life these days?
Hey, Dwayne. It's good. Busy. Just, we, still in Helena here, we're in the hybrid model. And so just really working through that. We've kind of found a groove with it, I think, as most schools that are in the hybrid model have kind of found a groove. So that's good. And just trying to support